Welcome, Stephen Cope. It's so great to see you again.
Lovely to see you, my friend. With all those beautiful books behind you, I see Ram Dass there. Yeah.
Yes, yes. So thank you for joining the Seekers Forum. I wanted to begin by asking you about the guru-disciple relationship. I know that you have experience with disorientation and disillusionment from a guru relationship at Kripalu. Can you tell me a little bit about your experience with Amrit Desai and how that affected your journey?
Yeah, sure. I'd be glad to, Mark. And nobody's asked me that question in so long. It's really kind of fun. I was 40 years old when I met Amrit Desai, and I've always been a weird little spiritual seeker in my own way. And I went to seminary, but I didn't graduate because I came out as gay. And I was 40 years old and I was having a kind of a life crisis. My partner of 13 years and I had broken up, and I was going deep, and I was either going to go to an Episcopal monastery in Cambridge, Massachusetts, or Kripalu. I hadn't really been to Kripalu, but all my friends were saying, Steve, if you're going to take a year to do deep spiritual practice, you should go to Kripalu, because look, the monks where you were going to go, they all get fat and they probably drink too much. At least if you go to Kripalu, which is this yoga temple, you'll eat well and you'll be super healthy. And so my buddy Michael said, come for a weekend with me and I'll introduce you to the place and to Amrit. And it just happened to be one of the weekends that Amrit Desai, a very well-known guru back in the day, was doing a special ceremony which involved the transmission of Shakti Patiksha. I didn't know what that was. I had no idea. So I was up for anything in those days and still to this day. Anyway, we got on our knees and walked in this line up to the feet of the guru, who was sitting on a throne at the head of the main chapel that had been, of course, a Jesuit chapel. And he laid his hands on my head. And I had this remarkable energy experience. Now, I didn't know what this was. I'd never even read about it. But for about a week after that, I had a profound experience of well-being. I can only describe it as an amazing experience of well-being that really lasted for a week or so. It was only later that I learned about Shakti and the energy of the guru and so forth. That intrigued me, to say the least. More than anything, however, I was intrigued at Kripalu by the fact that there were, in those days, about 350 yogis, almost all Westerners, living together in this big building that had been an old Jesuit monastery, seriously practicing yoga, seriously practicing meditation, yoga, all the contemplative, all of the 8 limbs of the 8-limb path in yoga. And they were smart and creative and very forward thinking. And more than anything, I was intrigued by the community that this guy, Amrit Desai, had built. He had pulled in the fantastic world and community. So I went there for the year as a sabbatical from my psychotherapy practice in Boston. And I never left because it was so compelling. And because I had a lot of training in psychoanalytic theory and psychotherapy and so forth, I began to delve into the relationship between the Western contemplative traditions and the Eastern traditions. And Kripalu was glad to have me because that was of interest to them. Mm-hmm. And so I became very involved very early with Amrit and with the community. That was in 1989. And that was a community that was really dedicated to the notion that this man, this guru, had special powers that had been transmitted to him by his guru in a long lineage going back 2,000 years. And there was certainly some evidence of that. There was as a community of tremendous energy and integrity, I thought, and indeed, truly it was. And then 5 years in, Mark, was when, let me back up just a little bit because this is fun. As a guy who's really interested in the Western therapies, I noticed that the community, which was then about 25 or 30 years old, had a lot of people who'd kind of grown up there, as it were, psychologically, and were eager for some kind of new level of individuation as a self. And it seemed as though the guru at that point was putting a kind of lid on the development of the community and what we would call individuation in the West, right? So I actually initiated a whole series of symposia for an entire year that we had with different great psychotherapeutic voices. So from analytic to couples therapy to family therapy. And we had some of the great voices in Western psychotherapy. We had Tom Yeomans from psychospirituality, and Sylvia Boorstein came, Marion Woodman from the Jungian perspective. And so over the course of a year, we did that. And then we had a big conference where we invited them all back. And we all got together and looked at what we had done. It was very shortly after that the news was revealed that Amrit had apparently been having sexual liaisons this is the old story, with disciples, because they were called disciples back in the day. And it really blew the community up, so that many, many people who had thought of this man as a kind of god and had imbued him with superhuman qualities left the community. In fact, most of the senior people did leave at that point, either then or within the year, or certainly even 6 months, precisely because they had imbued him with these idealized projections. Now, I hadn't done that. I never thought he was a god. I never thought he was perfect. I did think he was quite an interesting and I don't want to say quite wise, but very, he had some level of consciousness that was not common. And this was intriguing to me. And he seemed to be a true yoga practitioner. So I wasn't devastated by the whole thing. In fact, I saw it as an opportunity for the community to actually grow up. And this whole thing was covered by a great issue of Yoga Journal back in 1994 when this happened. And the article was called Shrinking the Guru. And they talked about the way in which basically what we've done is reveal the shadow side of these idealizations. And the idealizations went both ways, from the guru onto us and from us onto the guru. And so it all culminated in this great conference. And you've got to visualize this interesting scene in the conference. There are maybe 500 disciples of Amrit Desai sitting in the main chapel, which was the big Jesuit chapel, all dressed in white. And each speaker comes out to speak, and it's Jackie Small and Marion Woodman and Sylvia and Dan Goleman, and et cetera, et cetera. And for the first time, the guru was not sitting at the head of the room. He was sitting at the side of the room, okay? And all of a sudden, the last speaker was Marion Woodman. So Marion Woodman, the great Jungian feminist analyst, comes out. She's not wearing white. She's wearing red and purple. And she says to the guru, Amrit, do you know what these colors represent? He says, no, Marion, I don't. She says, these are the colors of the whore of Babylon, right? So she had just pulled off a brilliant Jungian coup in which she basically said by her dress, I know there's a shadow side under all of this white. There's some red and purple, and there's some darkness. And so the shadow was revealed, the flip side. Now, that initiated a situation in which we asked Amrit to leave at that point, and he did, because there didn't seem to be at that point the willingness to take ownership of all that had happened. And I don't know all that had happened and don't really need to. And we decided at that point we were going to reinvent ourselves from being a true ashram into being a 501c3 educational organization. So there was a small pod of us who stayed, and this was in 1994, went through quite a few lean years there, where we just barely held on to our big property and building and reinvented ourselves into the Kripalu that people know today, which is an educational organization, not a religious organization. I still and always have been friendly with Amrit. We occasionally email back and forth. I tell the story of all this in my first book, Yoga and the Quest for the True Self. And I know he likes the book and feels that it dealt fairly with both sides of this. So, and today Amrit is down in Florida, still teaching, still having built a little ashram for himself. And he's a remarkable guy.
And did he lie? Did he lie about these liaisons?
No. I mean, they were covered up to be sure. I don't know the half of it, but they were covered up to be sure for a long time. But not only by him. If you want to be a guru, you have to have people who want to be disciples. And so the deal goes both ways. And so the cover up, interestingly enough, was on both sides. Mm-hmm. And it was when we reached this point of individuation where we need to take the next step. Okay, we need for you no longer to be the idealized daddy, but maybe be the real daddy, or be a real peer. And it was at that point that inexorably, I think the shadow just poof, revealed itself. Mm-hmm. So anyway, that's my analysis of the situation. And that's what I wrote in my first book. And incidentally, I wrote that first book precisely to come to terms with what I just lived through. Mm-hmm. Because I'd lived through what now seems almost paradigmatic in the West, mm-hmm. where these very often brilliant teachers come, drop themselves into the midst of a crowd of disciples who are eager to idealize. Mm-hmm. And this deal gets fashioned that inevitably ends up in the same way over and over again.
Right.
Yeah.
When you say that the idealization went both ways, that the guru also idealized and had projections onto the disciples, what do you mean?
So I think there was, the best way I can say it is there was an air of unreality that began to saturate the place. And he was buying into it in the sense that he was buying the disciples' projections onto him. He was beginning to believe that he was, in fact, all-knowing and all-powerful. Mm-hmm. And this longing that we have, I call it the orphan archetype from the Jungian position in the West. The orphan archetype is longing for the all-knowing, all-powerful parent figure. And it's very, very dangerous when the person in that role begins to buy into those projections. And so that's really what I mean. He began to buy into the projections.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
And so what did this teach you about the hierarchy between a guru and a disciple and the pitfalls of that relationship, particularly for people in the West?
Yeah, it taught me that, there's a famous phrase that says, beware the guru on the golden throne. That is, beware of that person who perhaps a little bit like a snake oil salesman, presents himself as the guru who's going to change your life. Mm. Rather, I've found that the real gurus, if you wish, the most authentic ones, are usually much more hidden. They're usually much quieter. They don't usually see themselves as a world savior. So, for example, Neem Karoli Baba, who was famously the guru of that whole line, Ram Dass's whole lineage, and Krishna Das and so forth. Very quiet, unassuming guy. And at a certain point, I know he told Krishna Das and others, that's it. Okay, leave. Go now. You've gotten what you know. I'm not going to be your daddy forever, or you need to individuate, essentially. And so what it taught me is to look deeper for teaching and gurus, if you will. But essentially beware the guru on the golden throne, which is what Amrit had become. He literally had a throne.
Right,
Yeah.
right. Do you think that a guru or master is necessary on the spiritual path?
I think a master is definitely necessary, but not necessarily just one. I knew you wanted to talk about this today, so I thought about it, and I realized I have had many teachers who were masters, quietly so. For example, I'm a classical pianist, so I had for a while a brilliant teacher who had studied with Schnabel, one of the great pianists and of the 20th century. And she was quietly in her little town in Great Barrington, a profoundly masterful teacher. And talk about kicking my butt. She totally kicked my butt. But I learned, and I think there was a transmission, just as they say classically, that gurus give an energy transmission. I had a transmission from her of some kind that changed the way I played. So I've had, I would say, 5 or 6 people in my life who have been masterful, who have been teachers of a very special quality to me. None of them called themselves gurus, and not even all of them called themselves teachers, actually. I had one, and I write about this in one of my books, my very dear friend who was an Episcopal priest who befriended me when I was 30 and he was 50. And he was a brilliant, powerful man, brilliant orator, really authentic spiritual seeker. And we became dear, dear friends. I only had him for 6 years because he died suddenly of a heart attack. But those 6 years, I don't want to say I was a disciple in any way, but I was a student. He didn't call himself a teacher, but I was learning in some profound way. So I think that's what I would say, Mark.
So as a psychoanalyst or as a psychotherapist, how do you work with people who have been damaged through a teacher or a guru relationship? How do you deal with abuse victims, people who have gone through that and fall off the path and become disillusioned? I've known many myself who swung in the opposite direction because they were burned so badly by somebody they had put their trust in. How do you as a psychotherapist work with that?
You know, I will be honest, I haven't worked with it a lot as a psychotherapist because I left my psychotherapy practice in order to come to Kripalu, and then I never went back to it. But if I were working with such a person, we would talk a lot about disillusionment and about the actual positive side of disillusionment. That is to say, seeing through delusion in every way and seeing what's real and loving what's real. We would certainly talk about the sense of abandonment and the sense of betrayal, which I think would be primary. It'd probably be the sense of betrayal. I have had an experience of betrayal in a relationship, and I'm not sure there's anything more painful than the betrayal of deep, intimate trust. And so I would, for those people who've been so traumatized, I would think there'd have to be a slow building back of trust and a willingness to risk again. Again, I didn't go through that. I did not feel betrayed by Amrit particularly. I was 40, keep in mind, when I went there, whereas a lot of the people who were betrayed had gone there as 18-year-olds or 19-year-olds, really looking for what I would call the reparative family experience, trying to get a family and trying to get the good family this time. And in many ways, it was a good family, actually. But it had a developmental lid on it that didn't allow people to go, at a certain point, didn't allow people to continue to grow.
Right, right. So
Yeah.
what would be the middle path as a disciple or as a student between reverence and self-trust? You know, how does a person both surrender, which is a part of spiritual life, while maintaining a self, you know, on the ego level?
Yeah. I'm trying to think who said this. I believe it was Jacob Needleman. Are you familiar with Jacob Needleman's work?
Sure.
So openness, skepticism, and common sense. Those are the three characteristics of the stew that he suggests. I love that. Openness, skepticism, and common sense all at the same time. It turns out that when you look closely, you'll see that in the East, now I've been told this, I haven't experienced it, but people who know told me that the seeker, the genuine seeker, looks and seeks for quite a long while before they find the master that they're going to dedicate themselves to. They don't just jump in. It's a whole process. And for some reason, when these great teachers started coming west, we lost some of the container, some of the context of this guru-disciple relationship, of this master-student relationship. And that was certainly one of them. The notion that an important part of the path is that first stage of seeking, where you discern who the person is that you really want to trust, just as you do if you're entering into an intimate relationship. You date for maybe years. I noticed that we're maybe too trusting in a way, and that we have been maybe too trusting in the West about diving into these high-powered relationships with people whom we don't really know, but we project a lot onto.
It's particularly dangerous in spiritual matters because people don't know what they don't know around spirituality. So a person can pretend to be enlightened, pretend to have this kind of liberation, and be a complete charlatan in a way that you can't if you can't pretend to be a jet pilot and not be able to fly the plane. But a spiritual teacher can pretend that. So we really don't have the criteria to measure, what's true and what isn't. So you talk about beware the guru on the golden throne. What are some of the other things to watch out for in a teacher, sort of red flags that you would recommend people be alert to?
Anything that gives you a whiff of exclusivism, that is to say, the teacher who says, I have the way and the truth and the light, and this is it, and everything else is erroneous in some way. That immediately tells you that you're in the wrong place, because there are many ways up that mountain. There are many authentic paths up the mountain, and I believe they converge at a certain point. But I, now having been in that kind of world that's flavored with gurus, sometimes I've seen a lot of that, and you can sniff it out right away. It's truly a mark of cultism. And it's not in any way unique to Eastern spirituality. I mean, there are plenty of Protestant sects, of Catholic sects who say, we have the only way. I have people in my family who are fundamentalists in the Christian world. And they firmly believe that I am going to hell. And because I've found a different doorway in. And so that's certainly one of the things I would look for. One of the ways you can tell that is, do they allow you to leave? What happens when people leave? That's like a real sign. And there was a whiff of this at Kripalu even then, even though I don't think it was a true cult the way many others have been. There was a whiff of, if you left, you were betraying. And I never liked that, and I never bought into it. But I've seen other similar guru situations in which there was a real strong condemnation if you left. Very much like when I was growing up in the Midwest, I grew up in Ohio, where there were a lot of Amish and Mennonites. And there was, as we all know now from TV, the Amish had that beautiful year off when they allowed the 18-year-olds to explore. And then they usually would come back. But if they decided to leave, they were often banished, cut off. And that's another characteristic of cultish kind of behavior. It's black and white thinking, essentially.
Black and white thinking, right? Yeah. This or that, me right. Or the others. Exactly. What do you think, Steve, about the crazy wisdom approach to enlightenment? Those teachers who say, I'm sleeping with you to liberate you from your from your issues. I knew a woman who was involved with a Rinpoche who did exactly that. And when she asked him, "Why are you pinning me on the bed?" He said, we're breaking that ego. We're just shattering that ego and teaching you surrender.
Oops.
And she let it happen.
And how did it go for her?
She's still with him.
She's still with him.
Yeah. She's still with him. It didn't actually go to full-on violation, but he was always doing these kind of sexual pranks with her. But people like Trungpa, people like Da Frijan, who use these very unconventional techniques that seem completely counterintuitive to awaken people. How do we trust those people, or do you think it's just a dangerous path to experiment with?
It's a great question, Mark. My first relationship with a guru type was Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche. Back in Boston, I was in graduate school, and I got very interested in this dude who studied at Cambridge, had written some brilliant books. They were just founding Shambhala back in those days, and was a brilliant, brilliant teacher. And he was a crazy wisdom guru without any doubt.
Yes.
And I went to study with his group. It was called Dharma Dhatu in Boston. And I learned a tremendous amount. And I learned a tremendous amount about meditation. Those people really meditated. They were exquisite in their technique. And I learned a tremendous amount from them. But I did get to watch the crazy wisdom side, as Trungpa himself appeared to have alcoholism. I mean, I didn't have a clinical meeting with him, but that's how it looked. Right. And then his successor appeared to believe that he was incapable of contracting AIDS. This is Ursel Tenzin, and did contract AIDS and did pass it on to students. Yes. So there was some very dangerous stuff going on in the crazy wisdom side of things. Now, I'm not exactly an expert in that. There are sides of that I would say are tantric, that when practiced within the proper container and with the proper teacher are probably very effective. I think part of it, Mark, I would say is temperament. I am not drawn to the crazy wisdom guru. I'm just not. I'm much more of a Platonist. I'm much more of a linear, work-a-day, craftsman-like guy in everything I do. But there are people who are maybe authentically drawn to the crazy wisdom person for some good reason. I don't want to say that they're not. I do think that the sexual violations go over some kind of line for me, that those really do induce a tremendous amount of trauma that's really damaging, that perhaps is not understood. I mean, you've seen what's happened to Shambhala in recent days. They've been decimated again by the same stuff.
Yes.
So
yes.
I don't see in that any kind of secret wisdom that lies behind it, or secret intention. I just see it as I don't know, a sense of control maybe gone awry as a result of this field of projections that those usually men live in.
Mhm. Mhm.
Yeah.
It's also a case of people being excellent meditators, superior yogis, and never having dealt with their shadow, never having done the psychological work. So
Absolutely. Yeah,
there's so much imbalance
that's right.
in the enlightenment game.
Yeah. And early on, I'm sure you're familiar with that brilliant book, Transformations of Consciousness, that Ken Wilber did with Jack Engler and Dan Brown. And that book is now at least 30 years old. But I believe it's Jack Engler from Harvard who talked about the premature transcendence. And I saw that up close and personal, Mark. When Kripalu was in its ashram mode, I saw a tremendous amount of that. People who were unintegrated in terms of sexuality or just earthiness, their embodied self, and wanted to transcend. So we would very often have gurus who would come and visit from the East, mostly from India, and they would talk about transcending. So their hand would go up like this, and it was something about leaving your body. And it was something that happened up here in a chakra. And so a lot of people, I saw people who did the premature transcendence thing, and it didn't ever end well. It didn't ever end well.
One more question. Can I just ask one more question about the guru thing?
Yeah.
What do you think of this idea of separating the teacher from the teaching? When you realized Trungpa was an alcoholic, did that compromise your trust in him as a meditation teacher? Or were you able to separate the two?
It didn't compromise it at all. One of the things I learned at Kripalu is you can have a highly flawed teacher, but if the students are actually practicing the teachings, they can still become enlightened. Now, I use the word enlightened carefully. I know a lot of the great teachers in the West and some of them in the East, and I don't know that I know anybody who's enlightened. So I know people who claim they're enlightened, and maybe they are. I don't know. I don't know how to judge that. But I did see, and I experienced this myself, and maybe I was naive, but I was actually practicing what I was taught when I was at the ashram for those 5 years. Whatever was going on up above me with the guru and other disciples, I was actually practicing the teachings, and I was finding tremendous fruition in that. So yeah, separating the teachings from the teacher, great idea.
Yeah, I've always had trouble with the idea of separating the teacher from the teaching,
particularly
in the guru relationship, because they bleed into one another. It's the dishonesty that bothers me. For example, when Maizumi Roshi was told by his students that he had a drinking problem, he said, "Oh, do you think so? Maybe I should go to AA." And he went to Alcoholics Anonymous.
Oh, that's so great.
That's fine. That's fine. It's when there's denial, when there's covering up. That's why I asked if he had lied about his sexual liaison.
Yeah.
Because the fact that he didn't says a lot. And speaks to his character. So I can see where you could still continue to trust him.
Yeah, I mean, I trust him in the areas in which I trust him. Now, I will say that the communities that tend to get in trouble are the ones that emphasize in practice, in their practice, tend to emphasize in the meditation world what we call shamatha, or concentration practice. The earlier practices of yoga that do systematically promote bliss and rapture. And it's all true, it's all real. And yet that is like a bird that's only flying with one wing. because there's something that comes after bliss and rapture, which is the whole field of insight practice, which is meant to allow you to see through the way things are. And it's that cuts through the delusion. So I lived at Kripalu in a community. All of our practices were based on concentration practice and absorption in the one, that is narrowing the stream of consciousness to focus on one point and excluding everything else. Well, that's fine, but that's stage one. Stage two is taking that highly focused mind and examining how it is out there. And so that's a wisdom practice. And at Kripalu back in the day, we had no wisdom practice. So there was no way of investigating how it was, how you were being. Is that making sense?
Yes, absolutely.
There was no wisdom practice. And I think that's more common in the yoga world than in the Buddhist world, because for the most part in the Buddhist world, you get shamatha and then vipassana, and then metta and other things that allow you to get a more full picture of what's happening. But when you get, and even Sigmund Freud was on this, he called it the oceanic feeling, which perfectly describes absorption. And I myself have a very long-term meditation practice, which involves a lot of absorption. But Freud said this is creating a kind of infantilization of the person, if that's where you stop, right? So Freud was very skeptical about yoga. He didn't know about the other practices, the real wisdom practices, but he was right about the oceanic feeling, actually. Yeah,
definitely. So let's talk about your wonderful new book.
Oh, good. I'd love to.
It's about the Dharma in difficult times.
Yeah, right.
And first, let me just ask you, why is this book particularly relevant to what we're going through today with the crises, whether it's the pandemic, whether it's the war in Ukraine? What can people take particularly from this book now?
You know, I have to be honest, Mark, I began writing this book before COVID, before all the crap that's hit the fan so far in the last 3 years. And a year ago, I sat down as a result of an intervention by my agent and rewrote it. So it really speaks to some of the core issues that have now been unmasked in our world. Okay, so COVID just unmasked a profound amount of social injustice and unfairness and racism and xenophobia. And what else are we seeing in Ukraine right now but xenophobia and delusion, right? So I wrote a book that, it's my second book on the Bhagavad Gita, the most important text of yoga. And I wrote it specifically for the yoga community. So the yoga community in the West could come to grips with a yoga scripture that's really about how we should act in difficult times. We currently live in a culture that's completely eaten up by narcissism, by the complete preoccupation with I, me, and mine. And so the whole question of duty, sacred duty, is the question that Arjuna, the protagonist in the story, in the book, had to face the question of, when the world is falling apart in any number of ways, what's my duty in the face of that? Now, we don't like to hear about duty. My first book on the Gita was about essentially the Joseph Campbell view of finding your bliss, right? But now we have something a little harder. Duty is a little harder than bliss. So in the face of the fact that we live in a world replete with injustice. And the fact that we are completely interconnected with it, just as we're finding now how interconnected we are with Ukraine. The whole world is interconnected. What's our duty in the face of that? So I start the book with the idea, an idea that comes from transformational education called the disorienting dilemma. The notion is that we all in the course of life inevitably encounter a dilemma. The world treats us in a certain way, or we confront something in the world that doesn't fit into our view of how the world is or should be. And in order to come to terms with it, we have to refashion our very view of how the world is and what our role is in it. So we live in our country with a number of structural disorienting dilemmas, and the most important one is slavery and the racism that preceded it and followed it. So in this book, I apply the lessons of the Bhagavad Gita to the experience of slavery and racism in America, beginning with Henry David Thoreau in Concord in 1830, and then moving to Harriet Beecher Stowe, who wrote the great Uncle Tom's Cabin and a whole bunch of other good stuff, by the way. Then I take it to a brilliant young Civil War soldier, and then to Sojourner Truth, the great preacher and self-freed slave, to Marian Anderson and her great her concert in front of the Lincoln Memorial, to Martin Luther King, and then to Ruby Sales, who's a current day activist in Alabama. So I look at each one of these lives and the way in which they dealt with the disorienting dilemma of racism, xenophobia, and slavery. And in each case, it's very different, but each one of the cases elucidates a different aspect of the teachings of the Bhagavad Gita. And the core teaching is that, whereas in the West, we're fascinated by the idea of self-fulfillment, and yet we haven't fully understood that true self-fulfillment only comes in the context of the common good, the common welfare. So this is essentially what Thoreau said in his great essay on civil disobedience, which I write about. But this notion that we can only really fulfill what's inside and the greatness that's inside of each one of us as human beings if our work in the world contributes not only to our own good, but to the common good. And each one of these characters shows precisely a way in which their work in the world, Thoreau's writing and Charles Russell Lowell's soldiership and Marion Woodman's singing and Sojourner Truth's preaching, in each case, they master their art, but they do it in such a way that it profoundly affects the welfare of others. And so that was basically my task in this book. And I do think it's almost like, I don't know, Mark, you're a writer, so you know this. You know, when you finish it and you look back and go, who wrote that book? Like, I know this sounds a little arrogant, but this book just got channeled. I just showed up every morning right here for a couple of years, and the book surprised even me. It really did. So there's a mystical quality to the experience of writing that you know all about and teach about. And I had that experience, and when the book was finished in October, man, I was so high for a couple of months, having fulfilled not only my own vision of a book, but a larger vision, and a vision that does indeed, I hope, I wish, lend something to the common good.
Oh, it absolutely does. For people who aren't familiar with the Gita and the principles of the Gita, can we drill down a little bit into what does the Gita have to teach us today, in this moment of peril, that
Yeah.
people can use in their lives without being yogis, without being Hindu, without, just being human beings? What are the
Exactly.
universals?
So the major point of the Bhagavad Gita is that each of us has in this lifetime what's called a Dharma, which literally means sacred vocation or sacred calling.
Mhm.
Each of us at any given point in our life has a sacred calling, something that our soul, our deepest soul knows what it is.
Mhm.
And our job in this lifetime, according to this view in this book and in the yoga tradition, is to find that calling.
Mhm.
And there are four pillars of the Gita's teaching. The first is this question of discernment, to find what it is that your soul in the deepest way knows is your contribution to the world. What's your work in the world?
Mhm.
It doesn't matter whether it's building stone walls or raising a teenager or being the president of the United States. It's yours. It's your job to do in the world. And so the first pillar of the teaching in this book is find your Dharma, discern it. The second pillar is, now, having discerned it, do it full out. That is to say, bring everything you've got to this Dharma. This is called the doctrine of unified action. You unify all of your actions around what you know to be your authentic calling in the world, whatever that is. The third pillar, so discern your Dharma, do it full out. The third pillar is let go of the outcome, let go of the fruit.
Mhm.
Krishna says to Arjuna in the teaching, he says, it's better to fail at your own Dharma than to succeed at the Dharma of another.
Mhm.
You don't even know what success really is. Your job is simply discernment and doing it full out. Now, let go of the outcome.
Mhm.
This is a hard one for Westerners, right? But it provides so much power, so much force behind authentic Dharma. I noticed this last night in Joe Biden's speech. Joe Biden, whatever you may think of him, and I think he's fantastic. I love what he's done. But here's a man who's deeply imbued with the soul of a true spiritual aspirant. He's a Catholic. He's a true Catholic in the very best sense of that word. He's lived a life of prayer. And you notice that he doesn't crave credit. He's very happy to give the credit for some of the stuff that's happening right now to the European Union or NATO. He doesn't feel like he has to, it's not all about him, right? So I'm not sure why I brought that up. Let go of the fruits. Discern your Dharma, do it full out, let go of the outcome. And then finally, Krishna teaches to Arjuna, the fourth pillar is turn it over to God or turn it over to something bigger than yourself. So that, let's say you decide your Dharma is to your Dharma is to be a caretaker of the grounds at Kripalu, as I know a friend whose Dharma is that. You dedicate yourself to, this man, who's a good friend of mine, has dedicated himself to that in every conceivable way. That's bigger than he is. We have 250 acres of fantastic grounds. My friend Moose, that's his nickname, has dedicated himself to that. It's bigger than he is. It's stretched him. It's made him stretch in ways he couldn't imagine. It's not about him. It's about this patch of land that used to belong to a Native American tribe. And he's dedicated himself to it. It's just a small example of what that fourth pillar means. So discern your Dharma, do it full out, let go of the outcome, turn it over to something bigger than yourself. Those are the four pillars of the Bhagavad Gita. Now, what I've done in my new book is to look precisely at difficult times. And there are four new lessons that I bring to bear here. The first one, and for this one I use Gandhi, Gandhi was the most important student of the Bhagavad Gita in world history.
Mhm.
The Gita was probably written in about the 3rd century BCE. Gandhi took it and ran with it. He said, if you want to know what a life based on the Gita looks like, read about my life, because he completely dedicated him to himself, his life to it. So the first teaching for difficult times is take refuge. That is to say, take refuge in the spiritual teachings, in God, whatever you think of as your higher power. Wherever you delve in to find wisdom and truth. The first step is not taking action in the world. The first step is diving into soaking yourself in your spiritual wisdom. And the second chapter in that first step is that always includes tuning into the inner voice, the whatever you call it, awake mind, Buddhi mind. You know, Emerson, you're writing about Emerson, I think called it illumined mind. It's all the same thing. It's this part of the mind that's awake and alive and has vast perspective. So pillar number 1 in this new book is take refuge. Number 2 is peer carefully into the chaos of difficult times for your calling. And I use Henry David Thoreau, and the title of that chapter is Look First in Your Backyard, right? Because Thoreau, from his own little village in Concord, changed the world. He said, I have traveled extensively in Concord, which I love.
Yeah.
He didn't travel anywhere. He lived in Concord his whole life. Well, he did do a little traveling, but it was from there. It was from his one night in jail to protest slavery that he wrote his brilliant essay on civil disobedience, which was then picked up by Gandhi and Martin Luther King and all the rest of them. So the first point is look right in your own surround. Where can you make a difference? The second one is look for the gift in the wound. And here I use Harriet Beecher Stowe, and this is not all that well known. She wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin as a way to come to grips with the death of her 2-year-old son, Charlie. She lived on the Ohio River, right on the borderline between the slave state of Kentucky and Ohio. And so she was immersed in the horrors of slavery in the 1830s, 40s, 50s. And her son, Charlie, died of cholera. And she had the grief of a mother. And she began to identify with the slave mother whose children had been ripped away from her on the auction block. And in order to make sense of the death of her son, she wrote this brilliant book, which gets a lot of flack these days, by the way, which it doesn't deserve, because she was an absolutely fearless champion of abolition. And so look in your own first in your own backyard, look for the gift in the wound. The gift in her wound, the loss of Charlie, she transformed into this book that changed the world, essentially. So take refuge, look for your Dharma within the chaos. The third one is understand that, and we've talked about this, personal fulfillment and the common good must arise together. So in this, I talk about duty. I use the wonderful story of a brilliant young Civil War soldier who sacrificed himself in the Civil War. One of that generation of brilliant Harvard young men in 1860 who said, it's our duty to go to war here. And I use that chapter to look at the contemplative tradition's view of war. And of course, they wrap it around with all kinds of prescriptions. It's almost always seen as a sin, but occasionally there is something called a just war. And that a just war can be a war in which a whole population is enslaved. So, and then the second chapter in that section is Sojourner Truth, who of course, her story is just completely transfixing. The fourth pillar is understand that you're not the doer. When you turn it all over to a higher power, you simply become, you have the experience of being a channel of something that's bigger than you are. And honestly, with no false humility, I feel like I've been a channel for something with this book, and it just makes you humble. It's a fantastic feeling. Yeah, okay. Yeah, I sweat blood. I really did, because my editor and my agent kicked my butt. But this is the experience you can have when you realize, when you accept the fact that something is being done through you. You may not even understand it. So those are the 4 pillars for Dharma in difficult times.
Yeah, it's such a beautiful book. And I love the upshot, which is that crisis can lead to purpose. I think that that's something that people really need to hear today. So thank you for writing the book, Steve. It's wonderful to talk to you as always. And thanks for visiting the Seekers Forum, and I'll speak to you soon.
What a treat to see you. Jai Bhagwan, my friend. Be well.